Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a special guest on, Dr. Alyssa Parten. She is a clinical assistant professor of kinesiology at the University of Alabama. Her research centers on resistance training and female physiology with a focus on strategies to enhance female exercise performance and how resistance training may impact female long-term health, which is right up the alley here on this podcast. Welcome on, Alyssa. Really looking forward to chatting with you and appreciate you taking time out of your day to hop on.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and I really appreciate the offer to come chat.
Is school starting up or things about to ramp up for you here right now?
Yeah, we start school next Wednesday, so trying to get all the courses set up. I typically teach the same courses every semester with kind of one thrown in here and there. But like the main courses I teach are exercise physiology and strength and conditioning. So thankfully, I've been here at UA this is going to be my third year. So really everything is starting to be a lot easier to get prepped for. So thankfully, don't have as high of a course load, I guess you could say, going into this semester.
How many classes do you have to teach then, like per semester?
Yeah, so I'm a clinical faculty, which means teaching is the heavy portion of my load. So I teach 4 classes per semester.
Gotcha. Is that kind of the route that you want to go long term? Is more the teaching side of things, or the combination, or what does that look like?
I actually started here at UA, like I was still in the works of my PhD. So I got my PhD through the University of North Alabama, but I think it was my third year there that I was offered this position, but as an instructor, because if you are not finished, you're considered an instructor. So I took on that job because for those of you who don't know, like I'm married, I have 2 kids. Like it was not the easiest thing having just like a GA salary. So I took on this job while finishing my PhD. So I do have like long-term plans and like hopes of developing my research area and making that more of my load. But yeah, we'll just see how the winds turn and change and whatnot. But yeah, I want to go more toward the research route in the long term.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome. And then I think I just listened to another podcast. You got your PhD back in March, was it?
Yes, I just finished I defended in March, graduated in May.
Awesome. Congrats. Yeah, I'm sure that
Thank
was
you.
a nice relief to finish that. I know,
Such a relief.
especially with, I think a lot of, at least from my understanding, you had a lot more on your plate than most people do there. Like you said, husband, and then like you said, 2 kids as well too. And then I know you're also pretty serious about your own training as well too. So I'm sure there was just a lot of things going on there, and a huge relief to finally get that done. So
yeah, so this summer was nice. We took it pretty light. I just mainly focused. I didn't teach this summer. Just finished up my dissertation papers with the edits that I got back after my defense. Worked on some other projects with friends. So it was nice and a lot more chill than since I started school back in 2021 for the PhDs.
So what, if you don't mind, maybe just kind of give a brief background of like how you got to where you're at.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I work at UA. I did my undergrad at UA. So that's where it all started. So it's really cool to be back. But as an undergrad, I majored in exercise science. And it was really through that process of finding kinesiology and really just having my first like light bulb moments. And this is really cool information. It's really clicking. And I really just like this side of things, learning about the human body and how it responds to both exercise and the absence of exercise. From there, I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my degree. I just knew I liked this stuff. And I ended up just personal training for a while after I finished my bachelor's. While I was doing that, I gained some friends that were in powerlifting. And so I started powerlifting as well and really found a lot of enjoyment there as well as in coaching powerlifting. And so that's where grad school came into the picture. So I graduated from UA in 2014. I went back to school in 2019. So I took quite a period of time off just working. And I went back to school for my master's in human movement science and strength and conditioning. And I did that through Concordia University, Chicago. And during my time there, I really just figured out that I love talking about exercise and exercise science and all the things associated with it. And I wanted to educate other people who wanted to learn about it. So really soon into my master's, I was like, I think I'm going to go all the way. and decided to pursue my PhD immediately after. So once I graduated with my master's, that following fall, I started my PhD with UNA. And that's where I really started my research area. Didn't really know what I wanted to study when I went into my PhD. I knew I liked powerlifting and I knew I liked females. So we just took it from there, and I adopted some of the research area of my mentors while us really figuring out my own path. And so that was really fun, taking what I was learning from him and doing studies that he had going on at the time, starting to form my own research questions, and us really just laying out a path toward my research area from there.
Awesome. Yeah. So there was like a 5 year break in between that. You graduated and then you went
I
back.
know, I was old when I went back to school.
What was there want to continue to learn more or and stuff? And I guess I'm curious like how that transition happened for you.
The
And
5 year.
yeah.
It's funny, like I used to get a lot of comments on like my continued education during that time. If I had like my coaching resume pulled up, I have every certification you could think of. Like during that 5 years, like we were not being stagnant.
Right.
I was constantly traveling to clinics. I was constantly looking into and getting new certifications, doing different programs, whatever the case. I just hadn't really figured out that I wanted to go back to school. I was never one to love school.
Yeah.
So that was really where I think I grew up thinking I wasn't good at school, and I loved college, but I always thought that those 5th year seniors and those graduate students were insane for still being in college. So it really wasn't until I was like, I just really want to keep learning, and I'm out of certifications. I'm out of clinics and conferences. And so that's really where I was like, I think I should think about actually getting a master's. And so I did that mainly for the purpose of, since I was coaching and becoming more interested in powerlifting, I wanted to become more confident in my programming skills. So that master's degree was very applied. I was constantly like writing programs for like rehabilitation for the human movement side and different sports for the strength and conditioning side. And I loved that because it really did lay a foundation for how to write programs and really how to feel confident in the programs I was writing for a multitude of people. And I take that with me now with the courses that I'm teaching and like working with strength and conditioning and stuff. But yeah, so we weren't stagnant during the 5 years. It was just like we didn't really know what we were doing. Didn't have a whole lot of guidance.
I've always heard like with PhD, it's like if basically you have to like really want to like research something. Is that kind of what you would you say that as well too, as someone who's gone through that, or do you think it's something that you can learn as you go, like something you figure out?
I think really the purpose of a PhD is two-sided. It's very, if you want to become a researcher, if you want to be trained in research, then pursue your PhD. If you want to teach at a college level or a grad level, then you have to get your PhD. And so I wanted to teach college students. I would love to get to a point where they let me teach grad level classes, and technically now I can. So you essentially have to have the degree above whatever level you're educating. So as an instructor, I could teach undergraduates because I technically had a master's at that point. And now with a PhD, I can teach anybody essentially. So yeah, I think it's two-sided. There are different types of PhD programs though. Mine really was teaching heavy. So while obviously it still had a research component, and my mentor was very research heavy at my school, even though it was more of like a teaching school, I did get really both sides of it, thankfully. And that was intentional. I wanted both sides of it to be like pretty 50-50. But you can get a PhD that is more teaching heavy, and you would just probably go to school and work as either a clinical professor if you're at like a larger school like UA, or you would be able to get a tenure track position at, say, a smaller school like University of North Alabama.
Gotcha. Did you know what you wanted to research going in, or did you have to figure that out?
I had to figure that out. I was actually looking at my personal essay the other day that I had submitted to UNA. And at that time, when I was applying to my PhD, again, very heavy into powerlifting, but I was also like really into conjugate powerlifting. And I still love conjugate training. That, and then I had been working with roller derby athletes. Yeah, I had in my personal essay that I wanted to research conjugate lifting and roller derby, and my mentor still makes fun of me for those things because he was like, hard no. And so once I got into the PhD process and started working with Dr. Waldman on his research area, one of the very first studies I was involved in was really what's got the wheels rolling. And he was looking at metabolic flexibility. So how well you can shift between using fuels like carbohydrates and fats during aerobic exercise. And he was comparing it in females of different fitness levels. So he had a group of highly endurance trained females, and they had to be competing for an endurance sport. He had recreationally trained females, which I fell into because I was resistance trained, but in the consideration of aerobically trained, I was recreational because I was running like 1 to 3 miles a week at the time. And then he had the overweight sedentary group. And so he was wanting to look at how well females oxidized fats during a bout of aerobic exercise between these three different. And he found that the highly endurance trained, which technically we think of being most efficient in utilizing fats for energy, and the recreationally trained group didn't show a difference. And so I was like, that's so cool. Does that mean there's a lot more crossover between at least like the muscular, the type 1 or the mitochondrial adaptations between aerobic and resistance training? And so that's where my dissertation really came into play, where I was like, I'd like to look and see if there are any like fat oxidation improvements or like responses to resistance training. And so we really just took it from there.
Awesome. Yeah. So he had a study, and then from there you just took it from there. And because I know that was your dissertation was around that. And I definitely want to dive into that, the importance of that. So I see that's where the metabolic flexibility came from. So you were classified as what you said,
recreationally trained.
And I'm sorry, how did you say they based that? What did they base that off of?
They based it off of how frequently you were training aerobically.
Gotcha.
There's a lot of different terms for recreationally active. It really depends on, are we talking about aerobically or resistance training? Right. And so whenever it comes to aerobic exercise or endurance exercise, that's where they like placed us, or what they decided to call us, because we were doing aerobic exercise like 1 or 2 days a week versus the endurance trained where I remember that their criteria was that they had to be like currently like training to compete in something like a marathon or an Ironman. I don't care. Or I don't know, like something of that nature, versus the rest of us were just like, we do it for health a little bit, mainly focused on something.
I know you talked about how you really try to keep aerobic training in your program and stuff like that. Did that influence that for you in any way, or?
Not at the time. So most of the time I'm always doing some sort of aerobic exercise just for general health purposes. The only time that I ever really pulled back on aerobic training, and when I say aerobic training, it could just mean like I ran stadiums one week. It just depends on my schedule and what I'm in the mood for, versus like my powerlifting training is very structured. It's very like progressive overload and sticking to the same stuff for God knows how long, that kind of thing. To most people, it would probably be extremely dull and boring, but I love it. And then the aerobic side of things, to make sure that I do it, I don't put any parameters on it. Like it's just whatever I feel like doing that week so that I make sure I get it in. Other stuff I'll do if no matter what. Yeah. But at the time I really was like trying to run a lot more. If I remember correctly, this was fall of 2021. And yeah, I was sprinting probably once or twice a week and then doing like a long distance run once a week. But it just depends on my phase of life.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And obviously getting your PhD, things like that, I'm sure changed your training a bit there. So what, are you still competing in powerlifting, or what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, I am. I haven't since a couple years now, and it's never really intentional, but there's a couple of things that I really look for whenever I'm going to compete. One, powerlifting is a sport you have to pay to compete. So like for me personally, I'm like, I don't really want to compete if I know I'm not going to do better in at least one of my lifts. And so I had my daughter last October, been working through the postpartum stuff.
Yeah.
And we're doing really well. I'm still not quite up there where my lifts were pre giving birth to her, because honestly, I did amazing while I was pregnant with her. Postpartum is what sucks, not
Yeah.
pregnancy. And I've been working through that. I also hurt my foot like back in February. And so that's still being a little bit of a pain in the butt. So I'm still training to compete. I just haven't selected a meet to compete in just yet.
So just always staying ready, and if the time
Yes,
comes, and
I would say I've always stayed ready since I've started powerlifting back in like 2015. Yeah, been very consistent in working towards those next meets. I'm just not one to compete just to compete. I want to come in with a bang.
there's got to be a reason and stuff like that. How, when it comes to powerlifting, is like certain things that you train for, whether it's marathon stuff like that, or like bodybuilding competition, things like that. I feel like you probably don't want to necessarily overdo it. Is there a downside to competing regularly with
I don't
powerlifting?
think so. I mean, it depends on how regularly. I've had athletes who competed every 6 months, and I've had athletes who might compete like twice a year with a bigger meet. Before I started my PhD, I was a twice a year. So I would try and do 2 a year. And I was making progress with each of those. Then we had the first boy or the first baby and had to work back up. And then competed for probably twice a year for a couple years. And then the PhD got very strenuous and heavy. And then I had another baby. So we'll get back to that 2 a year. I think that's a happy medium because it gives you enough time if you're like me and wanting to make improvements with each meet that you do. I think it gives you enough time to do. I've had athletes that were just in love with being on the platform, who were competing like every 8 weeks. And we had to get to a point where I was like, I think we need to put a little bit more space in between here. But they were young. They were making insane improvements each time anyways. But once they got a little bit older, I was like, I don't think you should keep competing and putting your body under that much stress that close together.
More life stress, and then I'm sure things slow down in terms of you probably don't want to necessarily like peak as often. Is that really what I'm assuming too, the other stressor would be like if you have to cut weight, that probably is a big stressor that you
Yes.
look at. But is the art of peaking, is that a big stressor that the biggest?
It's both physically and mentally. I mean, it's very high intensities. Typically, like I am a kind of a fan of keeping volume at least like as well maintained as we can through then, so that we don't like drop that fitness capacity too much. But yeah, I would say both physically and mentally, peaking can become quite intensive on athletes.
Yeah, I can see, I guess from a mental standpoint, the act of the competition day and stuff like that, I guess, could be a lot. And that's something that, again, people probably don't think about from that perspective. What's been helpful for you, like postpartum, to get back on track? And obviously going through 2 pregnancies and stuff like that. What does that kind of change typically look like for you?
I am going to be the most stubborn person you've ever met whenever it comes to this. I went into it being like, I'm not changing anything. F all of these dumb recommendations. They have no evidence to support. I was not having it with my first. I was like, we're not changing my training. I'm not decreasing volume or intensity, nothing. I still ran stadiums the whole time during. I'm like, I don't trip. It's fine. I didn't change my coffee intake. I was like, no. For me personally, like getting back like postpartum, the thing that worked the best for me was not changing things just because during my pregnancy. With both of my pregnancies, I was hitting personal records throughout.
Oh.
So my bench press went way up with my second pregnancy. Like previous to that, my competition best beforehand was like 185, 180, and I hit 195 like at 36 weeks pregnant with her. I just stayed consistent. And my whole thing is if something doesn't feel good, then I'll change it. But unless there's like a reason, I'm not changing it. So I was still lifting heavy. I was still doing the same amount of training, the same volume, all that fun stuff. I would say it went easier with the second one, actually, because my firstborn, the only thing that bothered me was lunges. It felt like his foot was just chronically inserted in my hip bone. So I don't know what the deal was with that. But yeah, I didn't have any issues like that with her. Another thing is because I was a really adamant competitor when I was going into my first pregnancy, I started seeing a pelvic floor physical therapist at 20 something weeks pregnant. So I was learning how to engage my pelvic floor. We were working through those hip issues and just really learning the steps to take both before and after pregnancy to make that more smooth sailing. I even remember when I reached out to this PT, I was like, I have one goal after this baby comes out. I was like, I do not want to pee when I deadlift at home. So that's why I started with her. And we haven't had those issues with either one of them, thankfully.
That's awesome. My wife had like she got back to it pretty quickly afterwards, and that was definitely an issue. So definitely something to keep in mind there with that. I know I've heard that's super helpful for people to go
Yeah,
through something like that.
it was so helpful. So I learned a lot, and I mean, doing things like that, and it's another way of just having continued education. It made
Yeah.
me a better coach knowing the different exercises to work with my female athletes with whenever they started going through building a family, because most of them do and are or interested in it. And the number of women powerlifters that I've spoken to who are so scared to even have children because of urinary incontinence or being like pulled back whenever they are wanting to compete, like they've really seen that you don't have to go into it just, I don't know, just nervous
Yep.
or to do anything. So I really liked sharing, at least with the ones that I spoke or I told, because I'm very private whenever it comes to when I was pregnant. I didn't post it on social media or anything. But the ones that I was close with, the different power lifters, they knew. And so, yeah, I mean, it's so nice to see somebody go through that and it makes them less scared, which is all I can hope for.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So it sounds like for you, the big thing was just like not really changing anything. And it seems like that helped you get through that period of time, but then also the afterwards as well, too. It seemed like it really tended to help you. Whereas, like you said, you'll see a lot of people really change up what they're doing, whether it be like you said, out of fear, or I know you're also big on like auto regulation. So did you have to manage that in any way? Was there times where you kind of had to manage the auto regulation side of things a bit more? Or did you just, you said you're stubborn. So I would maybe, I don't know if you just push through or what.
Yeah, not during. I will say I'm so lucky to not have with either pregnancy like nausea or like morning
Yeah.
sickness or anything. So I never had that would prevent me from getting into the gym in general. But yeah, whenever it comes to auto regulating, like if my coach, because I've always had a coach, so if he programmed like RPE based lifts, then I would work up to that. Usually he would program percentages. And another way that he also programs is even though he say programs 85%, it'll give me a range
Gotcha.
for load. And so, yeah, I might have auto regulated within that like small range, but I never really had any issues like being within that. But yeah, I think it just depends on the person. Probably a lot to do with that nausea and sickness because
Yeah.
for the athletes I've worked with, man, if that hits them, it's really tough. I remember with Cohen, I was like, even if I am throwing up, I'm going to the gym and doing something. Thankfully, it never came to that.
Just take some, just rehydrate it and eat a little bit more, and then get back in there and get to the gym. I love it. From like a nutrition perspective, did you have to change anything there? Anything noticeably different from that perspective?
No, I've tracked my macros for so long that I continue to do that during. I also, having been around this environment for so long, especially so long leading into becoming a mother, I had already tracked my macros and worked with a coach to get like my maintenance calories really high. And I honestly think that was a really big gift going into pregnancy because usually it's recommended that you say increase your calorie intake at 250 calories trimester or whatever the case may be. Mine were already so high that there was no way I was doing that. And I think that helped to, especially like if I did have cravings, I could really fit them into my calorie intake for the day. So that was really helpful just in managing that and not feeling guilty or putting on a whole lot of weight during my pregnancies. So I wasn't like in a place where I felt like I needed to work on that after or during postpartum. So yeah, my nutrition didn't really change a whole lot in terms of quantity. I will say with the first though, I hated protein. That was tough. So it was hard to get my protein in. I think I really had to rely on beverages for getting most of my protein in. Because normally I'm a big yogurt fan, hated yogurt. I never wanted to see chicken again in my life. And then I did still like beef. So, and then with the second, I don't know. Hers was so easy. Nothing felt really different with her.
That's interesting. I feel like I've heard that multiple times where like sometimes like chicken or like just
Yeah.
this like for
I
whatever
still
reason.
feel like that's affected me. I'm like, I could live
Interesting.
without chicken.
It was like a lifelong change there from preferences. I love it. Cool. No, that's awesome. I think it's super insightful just hearing. And you set a PR during that time too, which is
And
awesome. That's crazy.
I
Never
love
would have
it.
thought that. Awesome. And then as far as training goes right now, like same kind of thing, just more so just make it like you said, you're just staying ready and everything like that. You keep weight stable, or you focus on any like phases where you try to gain weight or anything like that?
Not really. I'm 30. I just turned 33. And I told my husband a little while ago, I'm like, I'm done ever trying to gain or cut weight. Like, we're just like in this phase of life where it's like, I love to lift. And so I'm going to keep lifting and putting on strength in that manner, making sure my protein intake's in. I still keep those high maintenance calories. But I'm not purposefully ever trying to like gain or lose weight at this point. I'm pretty comfortable where I'm at and just doing it to enjoy it.
Yeah.
I'm never going to be a top competitive powerlifter. They have increased national total requirements so much since I last competed at nationals that we're probably never reaching that anyways. So to me, I'm like, if I'm not going to be that level of competitive, I don't really feel a need to try and manipulate my body weight or whatever for competing. It's just for fun at this point.
Fun, and then obviously all the health benefits of lifting and things like that.
And that's what I'm really interested in at this point, because I am getting older, and like your family members are getting older. Those become more of the things that you care about, I feel, as you age.
Absolutely. Cool. I'd love to dive into your dissertation and kind of what you worked on there. And obviously, like you said, it brings in the concept of metabolic flexibility, which I think will be interesting to chat about. So if you don't mind, just go over what your dissertation goes over. And if I have any follow-up like questions and stuff, we can just go from there.
Yeah, if I need to slow down or anything, please let me know. Or if you have questions, feel free to pop it on in. But just as a really general synopsis, my dissertation area was looking at fat oxidation in response to resistance training. And started out, and this dissertation project was in premenopausal females. My whole idea is if we get premenopausal women that have like regular hormonal levels, they're eumenoric, which means that they have normal fluctuations between estrogen and progesterone, the main sex reproducing hormones that are associated with the menstrual cycle. And it also means that they ovulate. So ovulation is like that midpoint between your menstrual cycle length that indicates that whether you're in the follicular phase or the luteal phase. And so you just have to have all these little things that are happening within your menstrual cycle to be considered eumenoric. And it's just essentially like health in terms of that menstrual cycle. So we were looking at this population with the goal of, if we find an increase in fat oxidation in this group of very healthy females, they're already really well trained. I had a strength requirement for my sample for both of my dissertation studies. If we find an improvement here that kind of opens the door, if it works, if it's effective in improving fat oxidation in this healthy group of young women, does that indicate that it could be an effective modality in metabolically compromised females? So those that are going through perimenopause, that menopausal transition, women who have PCOS or insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, things of that nature. So my whole goal was this is the first door that we're opening to a line of research questions that will look into the people that it really matters for the most. So that being said, I had 2 different dissertation studies, both of them involving resistance training. But the first study, I call it the first study. I don't know why, but I guess it was the first one that I defended in my defense. But one of my studies compared fat-free mass with upper and lower body resistance training on fat oxidation. So all of them involved resistance training, and all of them were looking at fat oxidation afterwards. So this one, we were comparing fat-free mass, which indicated that we were using the back squat and the bench press and looking to see if there were any differences between like essentially muscular region, like large muscle mass versus small muscle mass on fat oxidation. And really the reason for this, it stems back to a study that my mentor and I had read, and they had looked at aerobic exercise utilizing small and large muscle mass on fat oxidation. And they interestingly found, and this is a Scativo and colleagues study, but they interestingly found that the smaller muscle region increased fat oxidation. And so they think that this was due to reduced competition for blood flow to those muscles of smaller muscle regions versus large. They did it was like 2-leg cycling versus 1-leg cycling. So essentially like you're be able to shuttle that blood flow and use that oxygen for fuel utilization or fat oxidation to that smaller muscle versus if it had to steer away and go into 2 large muscle groups. So we've just had the question, I wonder if this would pertain to resistance exercises. And so that's where that question came into play. And we looked at back squat versus bench press. I did change up my 2 dissertation studies a little bit out of curiosity of intensity and volume load and if those would be different. In this study, we did a pretty high volume comparison, and they did 8 sets of 6 in their back squat using 65% of their 1 rep max. So they just did a lot of reps. We did 2 minutes of rest. So it was just metabolically demanding. And it also allowed us to achieve a metabolic response without doing too much of a workout because these trials were so long. Like everything entailed, it was like a 3.5 to 4 hour long trial, which is a lot for somebody to commit to. So if they had done an entire workout, good Jesus, that would have been such a long study. And I don't know if I would have gotten the sample that I needed for it. So we were able to achieve a lot with a little by doing just like higher reps, low recovery between sets, and like that moderate intensity. The other study, we used way heavier intensities, but I'll get to that in a little bit. So yeah, that was the first study. We compared upper versus lower body, back squat versus bench press on fat oxidation. I'll talk about the results first if you want me to before I get to the other one, or I can talk about the other one's methods first.
Yeah, real quick, and you may have hit on this, but just so people are understanding, what would be the benefit of increasing fat or the importance of fat oxidation or
that's a
increasing
great
that?
question. So having a greater fat oxidation at rest and really just like the ability to shift back to fat oxidation, it has both a health benefit as well as a performance benefit. From a health side of things, having improved fat oxidation capacity is a marker of metabolic health. Fat oxidation takes place only in our mitochondria, and we have mitochondria in our skeletal muscle. We have it all throughout our body, all of our organs and whatnot. And the ability to use within our mitochondria indicates that our mitochondria are at a healthier state. Like they have the content that they need to break down fats. So it has that mitochondrial health aspect, but it also means that kind of indirectly, but like we may have a better ability at weight management. There's more context to that, everything from like the proteins that carry those fats to the mitochondria and transporters, all the different things from the process of breaking it down in our adipose tissue to getting it in our skeletal muscle. But if those mitochondria are healthy enough to break down those fats, then that's a good indicator, just long term, that we might have less of a risk of developing these metabolically challenged conditions such as insulin resistance, diabetes, etc. So that's really what we're going for, because a lot of the times if you are not as efficient in breaking down fats, your body is going to use carbs to a greater extent. And that's not necessarily a bad thing when we need it, but we don't have as much fuel from carbohydrates within our body. So from a performance standpoint, if we can save those carbohydrates for when we're doing higher intensity exercise or we're in a stress state and we need fuel faster, which carbohydrates are that more faster fuel, then it preserves it for those situations. And so we're able to really preserve it, use those fats in those different conditions, such as just at rest or when we're doing different intensities of exercise, preserving carbohydrates for other scenarios. So it can have kind of a two-way benefit there. Yeah. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, no, I think it's just helpful for people to understand, what,
I agree.
because again, I think when people hear fat oxidation, they think, or like fat burning, they think it's like they're losing body fat, but that's not necessarily the case. That's the fuel that your
Right.
body's using.
Yes. So calories in, calories out, still the main contributor, but just from an overall standpoint, it might have a more of like just a long-term health indicator. I feel like indicator is a key word there.
And potentially like better body composition, easier to potentially changing body weight or body composition as well too.
Yeah, greater insulin sensitivity, all that fun stuff.
What would be some signs that you are like, is there anything that somebody could just do, say out and about, or do you need to go into a lab to get certain things done to see if you are good at oxidizing fat, or what? Yeah, what is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you would have to, unless you're just like in general making assumptions, I think you would have to go into a lab, get blood work done. The way that we measured fat oxidation was through a metabolic system. So if you've ever seen a VO2 max test, you're like breathing into that tube and it's like spitting out what your VO2 is. You can actually estimate fat and carbohydrate oxidation two different ways from the data that you get from a metabolic cart. One, you can calculate actual like grams per minute or grams per kilogram per minute, depending on if you're wanting to look at absolute or relative fat oxidation rates or carb oxidation rates. And there's just essentially equations that have been developed by people way smarter than me that you use the VO2 and VCO2 in liters per minute. And so you just plug in these numbers you get from that metabolic system and you can calculate fat oxidation. You can also just take a look at the respiratory exchange ratio, which is another number you get from the system. And it's a ratio between 0.7 and 1. The closer you are to 1 indicates that you're burning more carbohydrates, and the closer you are to 0.7 is more fat oxidation. So you can be on this system both during exercise and like around exercise. So we were looking at it at rest. We compared baseline resting measurements of RER and like actual fat oxidation rates at baseline and then after the resistance training session. Because one of the caveats to this system is you can't really do it during resistance training. One, you can't really resistance train with that thing on you. But two, you're technically supposed to be at like a steady state for a few minutes before you actually take those values. So resistance training and anaerobic training are not very reliable or valid if you're doing it during. So you have to do it like around it for better measurements. And that was really the point too. I think in my head, I'm like, I care more. I get why you would want to oxidize fats more during exercise because of the performance aspect. You are preserving carbohydrates for exercise down the road if you're doing longer duration or higher intensities. But me coming from the health standpoint of just wanting to know if resistance training increases fat oxidation, I'm like, I care more about the around exercise, because exercise is like 4% of your day, whatever they used to say in those memes on Facebook. I want to know if it's improving this marker of metabolic health the rest of the day. And so that's why we looked at it for a period of time afterwards.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's awesome. Yeah, not just looking at the exercise bout, but outside of that as well. Is it impacting that? So real quick, and then we'll get back to your study on this. I just have another question on this. So when looking at this, going into it, we knew that, I'm assuming aerobic training would do that, right? And so that was already done. But you specifically wanted to look at resistance training, and within that, you wanted to look at a certain population, it being female population with having a healthy menstrual cycle. And that's
so yes, in terms of, we know that aerobic exercise improves these markers of metabolic health far beyond just like increasing fat oxidation. But this is where it's just like me trying to answer questions for people that are outside our field. A lot of people just associate aerobic exercise with increased fat burning because they're told that doing light and low intensity exercise is going to burn more fats. And that's the case during exercise. But again, like, who cares what is happening during exercise? Your body's just meeting the metabolic demands of that exercise. We care if you're like wanting to increase fat oxidation afterwards, or you're wanting to improve that health marker in the grand scheme of things. And studies have actually shown, and where mine really stemmed off of was the anaerobic exercise. So anaerobic exercise, like high intensity interval training, even one of the studies that I used in developing my research was looking at high intensity resistance training, which is like high intensities for as many reps as possible with really low recovery periods. That way you can essentially knock out a lot in 20 minutes versus how long other resistance training programs tend to be. But they've found that the higher the intensity of exercise, the longer period after you finish that you're oxidizing fats or you're burning fat versus aerobic exercise, because you never really reach really high intensities. They go back to baseline. They're not really increasing their fat burning afterwards. You end up going back to whatever those baseline levels are a lot quicker, or not changing much from them in general. So mine was really like, okay, so if anaerobic exercise works and high intensity resistance training works, what about the type of exercise I like to do? Like a typical strength training session or just powerlifting exercises, that sort of thing.
Got you. That makes sense. Okay, cool. I don't think I have any more follow-ups on that. I think that was a good kind of summary there of fat oxidation. And then, yeah, so what were some of the results that you guys found within your studies?
Yeah, so we ended up, again, just following back up or reminding everybody what we were looking at. We were comparing high fat-free mass, which was a lower body exercise. We used the back squat because, again, power lifter. And when we were comparing it to lower fat-free mass or upper body exercise with a bench press. And we found that both of them significantly increased fat oxidation from immediately post-exercise to 90 minutes post-exercise, which is the amount of time we looked at. We didn't extend it further than 90 minutes. And that was due to time and also just like what other studies have been consistent with looking at. So who knows, maybe it continues thereafter. That's like a kind of a follow-up future research question if somebody wants to take that on, because I'm going to take a break from those long 4-hour trials. But yeah, so we did find that both muscular regions increased fat oxidation for at least 90 minutes post-exercise. While there weren't significant differences between these two regions, it is a note that the lower body exercise, the back squat, did trend higher than the upper body exercise, the bench press. And at 90 minutes post, there was a 65% increase in fat oxidation in comparison to baseline from the back squat and 45% in the bench press. So they didn't reach significance, but there was that trend there. And so it begs the question that if you're doing just a traditional like actual lower body workout versus an upper body workout, would there be differences? We're not sure yet. But yeah, so essentially what I take from that is doing any type of resistance training, regardless of muscular region, is going to yield those metabolic effects. If we are dealing with someone who may be metabolically compromised, would doing like more like larger size muscle groups be slightly more beneficial? Maybe we need to look at that population to really make that decision. But yeah, in general, we found that resistance training in general works. So just make sure that your resistance training, don't worry about having just straight on lower body days or full body days. Like you can do those traditional splits if you have like upper and lower body days, and you're going to have those metabolic benefits from it.
Awesome. And is that, and I'm sorry, that was in both studies, or just that was the first one, or?
The second one, if you're ready. Do you have any questions about the first one?
I don't think so. Not yet. I may have after you go through this one.
So the second one, very similar. Everything like in terms of our methodology was essentially the same. The two differences is that one, we, instead of comparing upper versus lower body, muscular regions, however you want to term that, we just compared a strength training session. So they were identical: squat, bench, deadlift, 5 sets of 3, 80 to 85% of their max. It was a powerlifting workout between menstrual cycle phase. So this is where we pull in the menstrual cycle into my dissertation. And so we compared them during the early follicular phase. So if your listeners need like a little brief 101 on the menstrual cycle, they typically say you have an average of 28 days of your menstrual cycle length. That's not necessarily true. It's considered normal if it's between 24 to 38, 39 days, depending on what book you look at. And the follicular phase is those first few days before ovulation hits. And then the last half of your menstrual cycle, in essence, is your luteal phase. And so during the early follicular phase, which is considered the first 5 days of your menstrual cycle, most females are bleeding during this time period. So that's during their menses. That is when estrogen and progesterone, those key hormones in the menstrual cycle that help to regulate those fluctuations, those hormones are at their lowest. So that's important to note because we're comparing menstrual cycle phase, which essentially means we're wanting to compare when the hormones are low and when they are high. And then during the luteal phase after ovulation occurs, that's when we see this concomitant rise in estrogen and progesterone. So that mid-luteal phase, that's when these two hormones are elevated. So we compared early follicular to mid-luteal phase. And again, during both of these time points, our participants were doing the same exact workout. It was 5 sets of 3 of their power lifts with 80 to 85% of their max, 3 minutes of rest between sets. Yeah, and I was expecting, I'll be honest, I thought that we were going to see a difference. And the reason for that is there's data to suggest, but some of it's from humans, some of it's from rodent models, that when estrogen is elevated, that you are burning more fats. And so whenever it is lower, when those hormones are lower, you are burning more carbohydrates in essence. And so between those two phases, we actually found, so the differences between those two phases are the low hormonal phase and the higher hormonal phase. So we compared this powerlifting workout between those two phases, and we're again interested in seeing if the fat oxidation rates afterwards differed. And so our study ended up finding that there were no differences between those menstrual cycle phases in fat oxidation, which is a good thing, because essentially I feel like there's a whole lot of emphasis these days on whether or not we need to change our training in response to just being in different phases of our menstrual cycle. And I don't discount our females like experiences in these different phases of the menstrual cycle. If you are not on birth control, you're not on some sort of hormonal or contraception, then I think it's pretty evident that they do feel different between the two phases. One of my regrets during this study was I didn't take like a survey. I wish I had just asked them a few questions between menstrual cycle phase, just because when the participants did their mid-luteal phase trial, even if they had already done this workout before, like they had the early follicular phase trial already, they without a doubt were just like expressing how tired they were, how much harder it felt.
I'm sorry, in the luteal phase? Yeah, okay.
So the mid-luteal phase, whenever they are toward the end of their menstrual cycle, these hormones, they start to pretty quickly start to decline, but those rapid changes between the elevation and the decline in them is really what causes the feelings of fatigue and the like premenstrual syndrome. So not most of them didn't feel bad on their early follicular phase. It's usually like toward the end of that luteal phase, maybe the first day or two of their menses, that they might feel icky. But yeah, they were still interestingly able to perform the workout just fine. They just felt different. And so I think that's like an important note whenever we are considering the menstrual cycle is, yes, you may feel different. No, you're not more fragile during. Like, women are pretty darn robust. If they want to do something, they can. But in terms of just like these metabolic effects or fat oxidation, like we don't need to change our training in response to the menstrual cycle for these metabolic benefits, essentially. But yeah, most studies had looked at it. Like during exercise, we were really the first to look at the response after exercise, so added to that literature as well.
So had you found a little bit of a difference? Would that have changed anything on your end there in terms of like takeaways or anything like that?
Probably not. I don't think it would have changed anything. I think it would have been interesting. I think it would have just shown that in like the way I would have interpreted it is when we do high intensity exercise, whether it's with anaerobic training, resistance training, we have some great hormonal responses to that lead into the increase in fat oxidation afterwards that make it extend for a period of time afterwards. The only thing that I would have interpreted differently if we had found a difference between those phases is that those hormonal responses from the resistance training bout itself plus the addition of that estrogen might have made it inch up a little bit more. I don't think it would have caused a reason to change your training in response to it. I just think it would have been cool, but I don't think that's the case. I think essentially what it is that the hormonal response from resistance training supersedes anything from those sex reproducing hormones. They're just not different enough to make that big of a difference.
But as you said, people are going to have different experiences, and some people might have worse symptoms. And again, I think this comes back to your kind of thought of autoregulation too, and you obviously want to use that, and that's how you would use it really at any point anyways.
That's my view of it, because my thing is I don't discredit your feelings on if you have those symptoms during that late luteal phase, early follicular phase. But also, I don't discredit your feelings on if you're more stressed this week because of work or because your children kept you up all night or whatever the case may be. I think autoregulation is a tool at all times, and that we can't just jump to conclusions of it's my mid-luteal phase, I'm going to suck today, I'm going to go ahead and reduce the amount of work that I'm doing before I even determine if I felt bad. Or females who may not experience symptoms. So I don't really have symptoms from my menstrual cycle. And so I never really use that as a consideration if when I'm going into training, I'm going to reduce the intensity or the volume or whatever, I'm going to do yoga instead. So I just think you wouldn't jump to conclusions if you had bad sleep or you're stressed because of work or you have a test coming up. You get into the gym and then take it from there. I do not feel as strong today, so I'm going to auto-regulate, that kind of thing.
So it sounds like, too, again, like the normal everyday stressors of life, sleep, some sort of life stress you have, like those end up being really the big things at play anyways, probably more so than the menstrual cycle. But again, you play it by ear and see. But the big thing being, hey, we don't want to have the program that's, hey, you're in your luteal phase, you need to not weight train or whatever it may be there, which are some things.
And yeah, you could support, like if you are a woman who experiences those performance detriments in those certain phases of your menstrual cycle, then you could learn how to support that with like maybe sleep quality, with certain nutrition strategies that may help to improve your energy levels or whatever in your recovery.
Like almost a little bit like, hey, this typically happens to you, mate, so maybe you need to focus a little bit more on the recovery side of things during that period of time, like double down on them. Do we see like metabolic difference? And you may have answered it here with this, but do we see like metabolic rate differences? Does someone's total daily energy expenditure go up during any phase, or does it stay the same? Or
so it's, you know how I was talking about how the back squat trended higher than the bench press in fat oxidation post exercise, but it didn't reach significance. I see that a little bit with that resting energy expenditure. It's not significant, but here and there it did trend higher. I did run some stats on resting energy expenditure between menstrual cycle phase. And I've seen this in previous studies as well, that there's really not like a significant difference. And in mine, I think it differed by like 100 calories per day. So it is not a huge difference. So yeah, a lot. I remember this like big pink book that I had a while back, and I do not remember who wrote it, but it was like one of the early books on like women training and stuff and powerlifting. And I remember it being like, yeah, you should increase your calories by 500 during this phase of your menstrual cycle or something like ridiculous. And we didn't see that both pre or post in my study between those menstrual cycle phases. But that's one study. I think we always need a little bit more before we make any conclusions for sure. But just out of what I saw, it didn't really suggest that.
So you said on average about 100 calories. So again, not a ton, but it is up a little bit potentially. Would you say then the hormonal fluctuations are a bigger thing at play? And again, it could just be people's expectations of what happens, but a lot of people will say, hey, their cravings and stuff like that, hunger goes up during that period of
Yeah.
time. Could that be something at play there, you think, with that? Or
Maybe your temperature typically increases afterwards. You have a higher or not afterwards, your temperature increases after ovulation, and that has an effect due to progesterone levels increasing. It affects thermoregulation. There's also an increase in ventilatory rate in response to that progesterone to try and get that heat removed. And so maybe that's part of the reason. But yeah, there's a lot of interactions that probably are at play there between those hormones and other like physiological responses in response to those hormones that maybe may make our reason for it.
there's a lot more at play with female physiology than male
There
physiology.
is. And one thing that's hard for me to, I guess, get around is like whenever it comes to hormones, there's just so much interaction there. And it's never like one thing. And I'm not an endocrinologist. I love learning and studying these hormones, but I will never understand, I feel like, to the extent that endocrinologists do. So it always gets me when there are people on social media who are self-proclaimed hormonal experts. And I'm like, man, I'm still learning about 2 hormones. I don't know. I just think that it's crazy when people just assume so much about these things because there is so much complexity to them. And I'm going to be spending the rest of my career trying to figure out all of these connections that they have with other systems and other hormones and whatever.
Yeah, you're 100% right. It's very complex, and I'm sure anyone who's studied it probably feels like they barely know anything about it as well too. Another question I had on this was so you mentioned that the menstrual cycle is on average, you said 28 days, but obviously from person to person it can range greatly, right? And so how did you guys did you have to test that? Like, how did you guys figure out where they were at? Because to me that sounds like that would be not a pain in the ass, but that's a big thing that you have to do and you kind of have to manage it. And from my understanding, that's partly why sometimes female studies can be challenging for this reason. So I'm curious how you guys went about that.
Yeah, I learned so much in this process of standardizing how we were going to go about this. And really, I think that it's such an area of learning opportunity based on like how studies do it, because I read how many other studies did it. And I don't think there's one correct answer. I had to figure out what was correct for my participants in my study. So I went into, just as just a down a rabbit hole because I think this is interesting, but I went into my studies and like before you even start your dissertation, you have to propose it to like your committee and you get feedback and all that fun stuff. And I had used a study from somebody in exercise science on how to determine these 2 phases of the menstrual cycle. And so everybody has their participants track their menstrual cycle first. So that's like step 1. If you're going to be using people that are normally menstruating or eumenorrheic, they have got to be off birth control for at least like the last 3 or 6 months, depending on how extensive you want to make your criteria. They need to not be anywhere near really pregnancy or postpartum. They're at least 6 months to a year out from being postpartum. That way these hormonal levels are back to what they're supposed to be. And so you have them track their menstrual cycle. On top of that, you have to confirm ovulation. And so you can get ovulation sticks. They look like a pregnancy test, and they just ensure this other hormone called luteinizing hormone surges, because when you're going through your follicular phase, estrogen is going to gradually climb. And once it reaches its peak toward that late follicular phase, it causes this really quick surge in luteinizing hormone. That one is the one that causes ovulation to occur. And then from there, you have your luteal phase. So you have to test for ovulation. And that in of itself was a pain in the ass because the kit's going to be like, if their menstrual cycle length is this long, then they need to start testing for ovulation on this day. I had some people, we missed it and had to do it again the next month. Or some people where we used so many ovulation sticks because it was way later than the kit suggested it was going to be. That was a learning curve. From there, figuring out the mid-luteal phase, going back to what I proposed, the study that I initially used was like, we confirmed mid-luteal phase by taking 70 to 75% of their menstrual cycle length and determined that was their mid-luteal phase. Within the very first participant, I was like, that is not going to work, because if their ovulation day wasn't within 2 days of when it was predicted from this like kit, that 70 to 75% would have been completely incorrect. It would have been too soon when those hormones were still not elevated enough. It would have been too late. They were about to start their menstrual cycle. So we ended up making sure we were pretty consistent with their menstrual cycle length for at least like 3 months. So I had them back. That way I had a pretty good average of what their menstrual cycle length was. We got ovulation, and from there I calculated 50% of that ovulation day to the end of their average menstrual cycle length, so that I could get a pretty darn good idea of when that mid-luteal phase was. And I gave them 3-day options. I'm like, here is your mid-luteal phase day. You need to come in here to here. That way, like, we were right there at the little peak of when those hormones are elevated. And yeah, it was really tough, but I was really glad and thankful that my brain actually got information early enough in my dissertation that I wasn't like halfway through them before I realized that this whole 70-75% estimation was not going to work. And then I've also seen other studies who would just be like, we did 4 to 8 days after ovulation. I'm like, that might have been the length of their mid-luteal or their luteal phase, or that might have been not long enough. So I found that was really interesting. It makes me wonder a lot about different results of research, because it's okay, maybe we weren't testing them in that high hormone phase like you thought. So, or it wasn't consistent between people. So it is interesting whenever you're reading stuff after that to wonder.
Like you said, then even within you have the variability from person to person, but then I would imagine within that, like, some people are also going to have some variability from cycle to cycle as well too, depending on what they have going on. So you also have that noise with it as well too.
Yeah, stress can make a huge difference. I had one participant that we ended up starting her all over in recruiting for the study, because when I had first recruited her, she was going on vacation to Italy or something, and traveling threw her cycle link off so much that I kept her on the back burner until I was like almost done with my dissertation, because I wanted her to make sure that she got back to that like average menstrual cycle length before I started testing her. So I started my dissertation back in March, and she was one of my first people I signed up. We didn't do her studies. Like, I tested her maximal strength test, and then we put her through these metabolic trials like in, I think, August, because I was like, I just want to make sure you get back to normal before we start using all these ovulation tests and trying to confirm these things. So yeah, stress can be a big factor there.
Would you change anything next time around in terms of how you go about that, or would you keep it pretty similar?
I think we did such a good job, because honestly, like, these were my babies, and I was like, I am not effing this up if I can do anything about it. I was really proud of like how I went about these studies and how strenuous I was on them. I'm sure I annoyed the living mess out of all my participants about all their reminders and stuff of how to come into these trials. But if I had to do it differently, when I mentioned the survey, that was really the only thing where I was like, dang, like, I could have probably had a whole nother study out of this if I had just done some surveys with them, just some easy Likert stick scales. And then it's always nice if you have more access to different things. We did hormonal analyses with saliva samples to confirm menstrual cycle phase. But that's all they really can do. They can confirm that like hormones were higher here, hormones were lower here. But the like specifics of estrogen, progesterone concentrations can't really come from those saliva samples. They can be like 1 to 2% off, which is a lot when it comes to hormones. Hormone concentrations can be so minuscule but cause such great changes within your systems. So 1 to 2% differences can be quite a bit with these hormones. And if I had been able to do blood tests, that would have been super fun. We were indirectly or estimating fat oxidation with that metabolic cart. And there are a little bit more upscale ways that you can test fat oxidation. They have different probes that you can literally insert in muscles. You can do blood tests, things of that nature. So it would be super fun to have more access to that sort of thing, which we just didn't have. But yeah, so not so much what I would do differently in terms of like the decisions that were made, but if I had more toys, I would have used them.
I love it. So what would be some like kind of practical takeaways for people listening to this from these studies?
Resistance train. Get your training in, because the whole purpose really is, it's okay if there are like benefits to resistance training outside of those more commonly known, like increasing muscle mass, bone density, body composition, those things. Like if there are crossover with aerobic exercise and you have a woman who hates it or is just not willing to adhere to it, or doesn't have the time availability to commit to like hours of cardio, get your resistance training in, because there is some crossover there that may help in long-term adaptations to these markers of metabolic health. So that's really the first takeaway. And then hopefully soon we'll have some more takeaways in terms of if it does help to promote metabolic health in those metabolically challenged states already. So do it now and prevent it. And then for those, hopefully there are some indicators that it would be an effective mode of exercise for improving those metabolically challenged, which I think there are already, but we'll look at it specifically in this sense.
Are you going to be doing those, or is that something that you're hoping other
It's
people?
No, I would love to. So I definitely plan to. Right now, I have this like long-term plan for my research area. I have a little perimenopausal team that I'm working with here at UA, me and a couple of students. And really our first objective was to see what literature is already out there on resistance training in perimenopausal women. And so just getting a really good literature review and just a systematic review down on, is there any indicators out there that resistance training would promote metabolic health? But specifically, I'm interested in perimenopause at this point. And then we are also working on like a survey, because I'm really curious to see, because this is just my bias being around powerlifting and a lot of female masters athletes, see if there's any differences in the symptoms associated with perimenopause between those that are training like a powerlifter or just straight training in general and those who are not. We actually have already submitted an editorial commentary type paper that does break down the different symptoms of perimenopause and why we think resistance training could combat those symptoms. So this is like that next step, is actually getting feedback from women to see if they feel any difference. Like they don't get hot flashes as often if they're training, things of that nature. And then from there, I'd like to repeat my studies in that group. So that's whenever I'm gonna look at that. I need a break though.
Of course. Yeah, it sounds, again, a lot goes into these
I need a
studies.
PhD student is what I need.
When you do these and these say metabolically compromised people, what do you speculate will happen? Do you think it will be the same kind of situation, or can you speculate on that, what you think will happen?
Yeah, I don't think that's a word, but we're gonna pretend it is. But yeah, I think that we would see improvements in fat oxidation. And so then post resistance training, if it's happening in already healthy women who are already well trained, then that kind of tells me that maybe this is going to be effective in perimenopausal women who are dealing with crazy fluctuations in estrogen or declining estrogen levels. Maybe they're already dealing with weight management issues. So I think that they would potentially see improvements there, whether that's, and mainly in response to just the hormonal milieu of resistance training happening in general, or high intensity resistance training happening in general. So yes, I think that's what would happen. And then it just comes into the question of cumulatively what's going to happen. If you're resistance training multiple days a week and you are oxidizing fat for at least 90 minutes, probably more of that time afterwards, then over time, is that going to start to show changes in just their baseline levels and across that period of time?
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's really cool. So again, you'll do that over time there. Is there anything else that you want to hit on or anything like that in terms of the studies or anything you found or any like takeaways or anything like that you think would be useful for the audience or anything like that?
Yeah, I think we touched on it. Let's all put it all in a nicely gifted box. Resistance train. It doesn't matter what split you do, whatever you prefer and what works for your schedule. And don't automatically change things based on menstrual cycle. Just take it more individually. And if you need to auto-regulate, by all means do that. But essentially, having this mode of exercise in your life, in your schedule, is going to help with not just improved body composition, increased muscle mass, increased bone density over time, which is things that can also be affected by age and just becoming more busy or sedentary over time. But it can also improve your metabolic health, most likely. We just have these additional benefits to resistance training that we're really seeing with the more evidence that we have come out.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's awesome. And then real quick, would nutrition play a role in this in any way, do you think?
I think so. I haven't specifically done any supplemental or nutrition research yet. My PhD sister, I like to call her, did though. So she did her dissertation looking at like protein for doing high intensity resistance training and high intensity interval training. I don't think she saw a huge difference, but she did, just like me, see a fat oxidation for a long time afterwards. But I think that more research needs to be done there, because that was contradictory to some other evidence that I've seen out of one of my mentors' labs. Dr. Smith Ryan at UNC Chapel Hill has done some studies also looking, and that's where my PhD sister adapted her research from. But they've looked at protein and have found that like even like a small serving of protein before you train can increase fat oxidation for even longer after exercise. So may still need to look into the intricacies of that and making that like an effective option or nutrition strategy.
Awesome. Cool. Really appreciate your time. Before I let you go, you've been at it, but is there anything coming up or anything that you want to let the audience know about? And then where can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram. It's just, oh wait, I changed it. It's Prof Parten now. We changed it after I defended. So PROF, like professor, Parten, Parten. You can also find an Instagram in my account in my bio there for my lab. And so if you are interested in the research that we're doing and coming out with, I like to highlight what we are doing and the presentations and whatnot my students are doing there.
And that's the Fem Power team.
Yep.
Awesome. Love it. Cool. All right, Alyssa, really appreciate your time. A ton of great information in here, and we'll chat with you soon.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.